When people think of the First World War, one of the very first images that comes to mind is of soldiers in the filthy, muddy trenches, fighting, smoking, or just being miserable. So today, here's a special episode of our show about the war in the trenches. I'm Indy Neidell. Welcome to the Great War. The First World War began and ended with a great deal of movement and huge offensives. However, it remains typified by its lack of movement and the years of stalemate on the Western Front, and the trenches were the front lines. But behind them were a mass of supply lines, training establishments, storage, workshops, headquarters, and all the other essentials of war where the majority of troops were employed. The idea of digging into the ground for protection was not a new idea or unique to the Great War. It was, for example, widespread in the U.S. Civil War and the Russo-Japanese War. Trench warfare in World War I began in September 1914, just after the Battle of the Marne, north of Paris. The Germans pulled back to the Aisne River and dug into their positions. The British and the French followed suit. What we saw over the following 2 months is known as the Race to the Sea, as trench lines grew and grew northward toward the Channel and the North Sea, and each side tried to outflank the other to gain an advantage. By the end of November, there was a continuous line of trenches between Switzerland and the North Sea. At first, the trenches were little more than foxholes or ditches, intended for short battles. As the stalemate continued, however, it became obvious that a more elaborate system was needed. Now, although the specific construction of a trench was determined by the local terrain, most were built according to the same basic design. The front wall of the trench, the parapet, averaged around 10 feet high. It was lined with sandbags from top to bottom and also had 2 or 3 more feet of sandbags stacked above ground level. In parts of Italy, trenches were dug in rock, in Palestine in sand. In France, the trenches ran through towns and villages, industrial works, coal mines, brickyards, across railway tracks, through farms, fields, and woods, across rivers, canals, and streams, and each feature presented its own set of challenges for the men who had to dig in and defend. The front line of a trench facing the enemy was called the main fire trench. It's not a straight line and it's dug in sections, so if an artillery shell explodes in one section, or bay, only that section is affected. Behind that is another line called a support line. Now here you find dugouts cut into the side of the trench wall, often very small, but with room for maybe 3 or 4 men to squeeze in for shelter, or for a telephone position. Communications trenches linked the rear areas with the forward lines, and it was along these that all men, equipment, and supplies were transported. Probing out from the front line were further trenches called saps, which often went beyond the protective belts of barbed wire and terminated somewhere in no man's land in a listening post manned by 1 or maybe 2 infantrymen. Now, the distance between enemy trenches varied from as little as 30 to several hundred meters. And if you captured an enemy trench, you had a new problem: how to turn it around, as you now needed a protected front in what had been the enemy's unprotected rear. See? Soldiers were regularly rotated through a basic trench cycle, fighting in the front line, followed by time in the support lines, then being in reserve, then a rest period. And the daily trench routine was something like this. An hour before dawn, those that were sleeping were woken to stand to. Everyone fixed bayonets and readied himself to guard against a dawn raid by the enemy. Both sides carried out their respective stand-tos, and despite the knowledge that each side was prepared, it was still at this time that many attacks were carried out. As the light grew, this daily ritual was accompanied by the morning hate. This was when both sides relieved the tension of the early hours with indiscriminate machine gun fire and heavy artillery shelling. Following stand 2, the men would have their breakfast and clean their weapons. The cleaning would be done in shifts though, with only a few of the men cleaning their weapons at any one time. Then came the daily inspection. Weapons would be checked, as would the men's clothing. This inspection would include a foot inspection for signs of trench foot. Now, trench foot was a medical condition peculiar to trench life. It was a fungal infection of the feet caused by cold, wet, and unsanitary trench conditions, and could turn gangrenous and result in amputation. Some 20,000 casualties from trench foot are said to have been suffered by the British Army by the end of 1914, although as trench conditions improved in 1915, it rapidly faded. Daily chores were then assigned. These could be filling the sandbags, repairing duckboards, pumping out the water that had gathered, digging latrines, and so forth. This was followed along the lines by the daily boredom. Movement was restricted in the trenches to what was essential, so when men were not engaged in a specific chore, they settled down to time-killing activities, reading, writing letters, maybe grabbing whatever sleep they could. In the middle of war, the boredom was often crushing. With the dusk came another round of standing to, exactly the same procedure as at dawn. And with the onset of darkness, the men would be ordered to stand down, and the night's work of resupply, maintenance, and sentry duty would begin. Now, sentry duty was never more than 2 hours, as there was a real chance that a man would fall asleep at his post, and falling asleep on duty was considered to be such a serious offense that the penalty was death by firing squad. Nighttime also brought the need to patrol no man's land, man listening posts, and send out wiring parties. Occasionally, a patrol would meet an enemy patrol in the darkness, and they would each be faced with the decision of whether to fight or simply let the other pass. Such fighting, though, would be hand-to-hand, as gunfire would invite a burst from trench machine guns. It has been estimated that up to 1/3 of all Allied casualties on the Western Front were actually sustained in the trenches. To the men serving in them, death was a constant companion, even when it was quiet, and death came in many guises. In busy sectors, the constant shell fire brought random death. Many shelling casualties were buried alive, and those who couldn't be dug out suffered a terrible death indeed. All soldiers in the trenches also quickly learnt to curb their natural inclination to peer over the parapet into no man's land. To do so was to invite a sniper's bullet. Disease also took a heavy toll in the trenches, as you may imagine, but no overview of life in the trench would be complete without mentioning the one overriding feature that instantly struck anyone visiting the lines: the appalling smell, which came from several sources, including rotting flesh. The dead could number in the thousands or even tens of thousands. It was often impossible to bury the dead immediately following a battle, and they would lie out in no man's land for days before they could be dealt with. In addition, many died in shell holes that filled up with water, or bodies simply sank into the mud. The stench of rotting flesh was a constant in life in the trenches. Overflowing latrines. The men would try and fill these in and dig new ones, but soon there was no room to dig new ones. Imagine how this was after 4 years. The stench of humanity. Men who had not been afforded the luxury of a bath in weeks or even months would, of course, smell. There was also the smell of disinfectant used to fight disease and infection, and the smells of battle, cordite, or the lingering hint of poison gas. The men on the lines actually grew used to this olfactory overload, but it would overcome first-time visitors to the front. There were also millions and millions of rats. If you're wondering what the men ate, food for soldiers in the trenches during World War I was at times a luxury. Getting hot food from the field kitchens to the frontline trenches could be impossible when a battle was imminent or in progress. Now, at the beginning of the war, soldiers got just over a pound of meat each, the same in bread, and a half pound of vegetables each day. But by 1917, the official ration was much smaller. Fresh meat was getting harder to come by, and the ration was reduced to just 6 ounces of bully beef. Common foods were makanaki stew and hard biscuits. All men received the same rations, and the ranks were always fed before the officers, although when able, the horses ate before both. There was no official vegetarian option, although provision was made for Indian personnel. There was very little waste, and leftovers were sold as swill to local farmers, while drippings were saved for use in manufacturing explosives. The key to success in the trenches was communication, and the mainstay in communications was the runner, who braved bullets and shells, mud and mayhem to take messages to and from forward positions. Although telephones were relatively commonplace, they relied on wires that were easily cut by shell fire or by accident. A big use for the telephone was from forward observation posts to spot for the artillery, and it was not a happy soldier who was told, in the face of shell fire and rifle bullets, to go out and trace and repair breaks in the telephone wires. It was vital, though, for without instant communication, a commander was in an impossible position. Radio was still a fairly new medium, but the wireless advantage was obvious, and it developed rapidly throughout the war, becoming quite sophisticated and common in the trenches by the end. Mud, rats, bad food, disease, dead bodies, unbearable smells, artillery shells, machine guns, no man's land, trench foot, and boredom. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what life in the trenches was like. I don't know about you, but I find it hard to imagine anything worse than the filth, the smell, and the depression of the trenches, with the constant threat of sudden death, and the psychological effect on the soldiers of the war was catastrophic. There is a romantic notion of war, but you won't find it here. The darkness crumbles away. It is the same old druid time as ever. Only a live thing leaps my hand, a queer sardonic rat, as I pull the parapet's poppy to stick behind my ear. Droll rat, they would shoot you if they knew your cosmopolitan sympathies. Now you have touched this English hand, you will do the same to a German soon, no doubt, if it be your pleasure to cross the sleeping green between. It seems you inwardly grin as you pass. Strong eyes, fine limbs, haughty athletes, less chance than you for life, bonds to the whims of murder, sprawled in the bowels of the earth, the torn fields of France. What do you see in our eyes? At the shrieking iron and flame, hurled through still heavens, what quaver, what heart aghast? Poppies, whose roots are in man's veins, drop and are ever dropping, but mine in my ear is safe, just a little white with the dust. If you'd like to know more about when trench warfare began in the Great War, check out these episodes about the Battle of the Aisne. And if you'd like to cook the McConaughey stew yourself, check out our video of the recipe right here or in the info box below. And let us know what you thought of the stew in the comments section.